welcome to the Hollow Bone podcast. I'm Bird.
Hey, I'm Henry.
And we're going to be talking about love today, finding the one. And we wanted to start out this episode by reading a couple of quotes that we're going to dive further into as we kind of get into this discussion and unpack this a little bit. So this is a quote by Wei Wu Wei. There is no such thing as love in reality. What we seek to describe by that word is emotion experienced in highly personal channels, charged with possessiveness, shadowed by jealousy, with its counterpart hate ever ready to take its place. And I want to just sit with that for a minute, just let that kind of sink in. So, to me, that quote kind of encapsulates how we often use the word love and throw around the word love when it comes to human relating. And we're going to be talking about these two opposing ideas in terms of love. So one is encapsulated by that quote that I just read, and the other is very nicely encapsulated by the following quote, which is by the same author. A lighthouse is impersonal, but when its beam falls on a specific object, it illuminates that object with the totality of its light.
Yeah, I think that kind of segues into, a really simple way to kind of define terms here. And I think without trying to create too much of another duality, you know what I mean, in saying that it is this thing, it isn't this thing, you have to kind of allow some grace, because that's what life does. And basically it's not to say that from the dualistic perspective of a love relationship that there aren't moments of what love actually
Absolutely.
is. That can still, you can still touch those things. But I think a lot of times until, it seems like you kind of touch feet down. I think I heard Ram Dass say one time, it's like getting balance between your feet. And it's like, at one point, it's like you've got all your weight on your left foot. And let's say your left foot is in the dualistic mind. Mm-hmm. And every now and then, you'll get a little bit of weight into that right foot. And then eventually, you'll go right foot. And then eventually it's balanced. You know what I mean? It's both feet on both sides. So being able to, but I think in terms of defining the word love, this is just a very clear example of this to me, would be, we try to, from the dualistic perspective, we would try to define terms by saying that there's love and unconditional love. Love is unconditional. There's no separation between those different things. We just, from a dualistic perspective, because we don't live from that place all the time, we try and basically set up a story about what the ultimate version of this basically completely convoluted word that we use all the time. But that's basically the simplest way, from my perspective, to describe that, is that what love truly is not, it's not that it's unconditional sometimes.
No.
It's
love has
all the
no
time.
Conditions.
No conditions.
Love has absolutely no conditions. And this is something that we were just talking about before we started recording, but...
Oh shit, excuse me. This is Bailey.
This is Bailey. We decided to set a vibe today. So she's going to be our podcast puppy. We'll see how it goes.
And speaking of that, actually, we were also just talking about this yesterday, that if you want to look at the term simply, these creatures have no story.
Yeah.
They have no story about what, no possessiveness in these different things. And how does a dog love?
Yeah, this is love without condition.
That's it.
This is love without condition,
Right.
without stories, without... So, and when... and when we talk about... So this is something that we talk about, you know, every now and then, but we were just discussing this before we started recording, that, you know, even using the word love at this point sometimes feels strange because of how much that word has been muddied by just humans in general, by the human condition, and from a dualist perspective. And by dualist we mean like right, wrong, good, bad, all those, like from a perspective of like having an identity or being attached to an identity and a belief system. But the word love has been so muddied by and convoluted by all of these other things. So it's been muddied by the idea, like ideas and beliefs around sex and the frequency of sex and what that should look like, or a story of if sex doesn't happen frequently enough, then I'm not loved, or possessiveness, that this person is mine and they should never stray, or that there's even just any ownership, really just any expectation around I have an idea in my mind of how this person should show up and behave, and if that isn't met, or if they don't fall in line with that, then very quickly that word love starts to get tainted with jealousy and possessiveness and feelings of unworthiness or what have you.
Yeah.
And so we want to kind of get into, in this discussion, like dig underneath that. So like talk about that dualist perspective when it comes to love, but also dig underneath that as well, and also get into some, you know, like from these two perspectives. So from like maybe at least like one male perspective and one female perspective, and maybe like different dynamics that have occurred in the past from that kind of dual perspective. So there's going to be kind of towing around in some different areas.
Yeah. And I mean, this thing could, you know, just like anything else, can show up like such a broad perspective. Like there's as unique as there are perspectives, you know what I mean? But I think that's like something that kind of seems to be very interesting in the current climate of the world that we live in today. I think it's like a very interesting mirror, because as much as like the world has gotten much smaller because of digital impact and things like that, never before have we even come close to experiencing this type of closeness, and felt further and further apart. And I think that is very much reflected in people's inability to connect on like a heart-to-heart level. And this is kind of like where a lot of this like train of thought like arose for me, like in the last week or so, was just thinking about this. And I was just thinking about like the way that the process works. And I was thinking about this quote that like paradoxically, learning to be alone is the prerequisite for learning how to love. And what an interesting thing that it is. And I think anybody, you know, that can be said in so many different ways. Like if you don't love yourself, you can't love another. There's like all of these easy catchphrases that like people can hear and they're like, oh yeah, that sounds right. And there's a difference between like, that's what I would call like an intellectual understanding. Mm-hmm. There's like, it's a night and day difference between an intellectual understanding and an actual process that happens inside of you. And the funny thing about this is like, this is where the words fall short, and you can't give this to somebody, because it's like I could tell you about this process and being like a stripping down to your essentialness, like bare bones, like stripping everything away. And there is like however long that takes for you, but there is a pretty considerable amount of time that looks like. But typically from an intellectual standpoint, the most you're ever going to get is like, well, let me go be alone for a month or a couple months, but still having one hook, that because what you're basically doing is like leaving yourself an out. And this is what we do over and over and over again. We leave these little segues out as opposed to like slipping the key under the door, you know, and going all the way into aloneness. But this is what I was thinking was such like a beautiful irony, is that you could say to another person that's like that is having a lot of trouble. It's like go find out what it means to be really fully all the way alone, and this will essentially, like, the byproduct of what you're looking for will come later. But the funny thing about it is, by the time you go through the process, you don't need it anymore. And you can stand in your aloneness. So it's like a very interesting.
And it's interesting too, like, we were talking about this before, but as you were saying this arose again, is that, and you touched on this, that we so often, and I know that I've done this, we have this idea that, okay, let me go be alone for a few months, but in doing that, there's an idea of, I'm going to be alone so that I can then find this thing. So there's still, that's what he means, that's what I'm assuming you mean when you say that there's that hook there, is that what's motivating that aloneness is that seeking. So it's still a seeking of the relationship of an idealized version of love through aloneness. And that's not the aloneness that we're talking about here. It's a full relinquishing. So I'll just maybe preface that with something that arose in my own process was, just like intuitively there was something in me that understood that until I can get to a point, and this is just for me, this is not saying that needs to be true for everybody, but for me, until I can get to a point where I can be fully okay and even like content and have gratitude for living a life, the rest of my life, with no relationship, with no intimate relationship, until I can be fully okay there. The love, having an intimate relationship with another would never be fulfilling. But like you said, is once you sit in that aloneness and stand in that aloneness and are able to let go and relinquish that clinging, is that you find yourself in a place where I don't need that anymore. Which is such an interesting paradox. But I do want to preface this conversation with, this is just a perspective. This is how we do relationship. Whoa. And that's not to say that is, it's very different. It looks very different than any relationship I have ever personally been involved with, ones that I have observed outside of this one, but I can only say what this one, how this one operates.
To be completely honest, just that, like, the cost, I mean, just the sheer amount of failure at every level, on like a human connection level, that's what it cost here, personally, was an upending of every idea that I ever had about who I could be in a relationship or who another could be. But the weird thing about all of this stuff, is now, like, looking at what most people would call like a romantic relationship or a loving relationship, I can't even really fathom how maybe the majority of people would do it, because it's literally like a fundamental difference between operating from this place and when I look back at that, like, operating from that place, it's almost set up to fail. Because all that this is accumulation and projection. accumulation of story, and then projecting that onto a counterpart and expecting them to live up to your idea that you have in your head that is all bullshit.
Yeah.
And when you look at it from that perspective, it's like, it's a wonder that anybody does it at all. Like, that's a miracle, I guess, in its own right. You know what I mean? But then from another perspective, like coming back to, you know, the aloneness piece, there's like a quote that she shared with me from Osho that, like, what is it?
Love is the meeting of two alonenesses.
Yeah.
And that to me is just like...
Yeah. And like that's an interesting thing, because it's like when you've got two perspectives that live from that place that basically come together, then it's just a sharing. It's just like it's like a sharing of everything, like, you know, simple, like the most simple things, you know what I mean? And there's that, without all of the stories and projection, is a really beautiful thing. You know what I mean? Because
and it's very simple.
Yeah.
It's very simple.
Like, the
it's
expectation is gone.
It's simple, it's easy.
Yeah.
There's no melodrama, no clinging, and
but I guess that if you think about it, that's also a really interesting thing, because if you think about it from this perspective that we were talking about over here.
And by this perspective, you mean
like the dualistic perspective. Like, if you were to basically introduce maybe even yourself 10 years ago to this relationship.
As it is now?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
So boring. Like, you would be like,
so boring.
This is... Like, there's no stickiness, and I think that from a dual, like when you're like all the way in your dualistic nature, what you would say that, like, oh, it lacks passion.
Yeah, or you don't care. Like, when somebody doesn't want to, like, when you're met with a counterpart that doesn't want to engage with a drama, it feels like a not caring.
Yeah.
And I can speak to that, because when, like, this first started, I was still, you know, like, had feet in that space and was still kind of working out kinks, and that's very much what it felt like. But then as the process unfolded, it's like, oh, it's very easy.
Yeah.
It's very
But that's
easy.
a really interesting thing to think back on. And from that old perspective, when your life is lived in between the low and high points of chasing peak states, this is the worst case scenario. Because this is this. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so it's like, from that perspective, it would be very disinteresting. It would you'd be like, where's all the sticky good stuff? You know what I mean? And so I think that's where people... that's what they say love is they're like, it's like the highs and the lows and these beautiful life. There's going to be highs and lows, you know what I mean? Like, there's always turbulent waters and things like that. But in terms of, like, the stories that you ascribe to these different people, place, and things in your life, it becomes, the water doesn't seem to be as turbulent.
Yeah. And there's no longer a belief or a need or anything here that's sticky that says that this needs to show up in a certain way, or that there's just like there's none of that. And this something, so as you were talking, this came up for me, something that we've talked about multiple times before, is that take, like, from a dualistic perspective, take two people in a relationship. How many people are actually in this relationship? This is from the dualist perspective. There's my idea of who I am.
And me.
There's my idea of who Henry is. There's Henry's idea of who I am.
There's Henry's idea of who Henry is.
There's Henry's idea of who Henry is. There's my idea of who we are together.
Right.
There's Henry's idea of who we are together.
That's just 6.
And that's just 6. So we could probably keep going on this. There's my idea of who he thinks I am.
Yeah.
His idea of who I think he is, or he wants to be seen.
Yeah.
And so that's just just towing the surface of how convoluted that gets, and how quickly is how there's that many dynamics going on all simultaneously.
It makes perfect sense that like there would be a fuck ton of distortion.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if you've got all of these things that don't actually exist, but they're still in the mind, like they're still roaming, and they're all kind of like, sometimes they coalesce and you're like, oh, a beautiful moment.
Yeah.
But more often than not, if you got split personalities, like they're not going to get along all the time.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of like the interesting thing, is that as those things, when you go through a certain amount of process, it's still unfolding. Like this thing is still unfolding. There's still like a maturation, and that's life. And like that's like a very, very beautiful thing that you would never really want to stop. Like you don't want to see an end to that. But there does kind of get to be a place where what once seemed like impossible gets to kind of be old hat, and it's just like your normal operating procedure. And then it's like, if turbulence arises, or if somebody's in a moment where they're caught in whatever, you don't need to add to it. You're basically like, oh, do your story for as long as you need to. I'll be here when you're done.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's just, but that's a really tricky thing, because I think like before this thing, it's like somebody can show up and they can be having a moment, and then you join them in the moment.
Yeah. And then it heightens the moment.
Yeah. And there's all these stories running, like, did I do something wrong, or should I be better? Who knows?
Yeah. And like, you did this, you should have done this. How didn't you understand this? But from this perspective, it's more of like, oh, we can just, I'll let you play for however long you need to play in that story, and then we can laugh about it.
Yeah. And those
there's no
synapses seem to get shorter.
Yeah, and there's no longer an attachment to, there's no longer a stickiness here of like, oh, when this thing is in a story, or when this is running in a story, that I need to do anything to fix it. There's nothing that happens here, nothing sticky here. It's just like, oh,
yeah,
just let that do what it needs to do, and it's totally fine.
That I think is like really interesting to think about is how your life, everybody's life, is perfectly tailored for them, and like definitely that includes this process. Like it's very unique to you, you know what I mean? And it's something that I can't quite fathom. And this is just basically something that I'm bringing up because, like, let's say that like you, let's say you find yourself. How interesting would it be to like find yourself dead center in the middle of like a romantic relationship, and you can feel that something else is being called forth, and this maybe doesn't align anymore, but it's something that I think that it's really interesting that, just from like a perspective level, I can't fathom having to, when this process began for me, I can't even.
So when you say process, you mean the process of negation. Of all of the
process of negation,
ideas.
Like when all of this stuff really started to happen, I can't fathom the idea of there being another person that I had to even contend with or consider. Like I can't imagine it. But then it's like an interesting thing because she was sharing with me recently that that it was part of her process. Yeah. And I think that it was part of mine too, but much later down the road.
Yeah. Because
human beings, having somebody else, for me, I would say in the beginning or towards the tail end of my process, it was just like the last little, it was kind of like a lot of the process the kinks had been worked out on a personal level, but then it was like, well, how does this show up? Because that's like a really funny misconception, I think, that people have, and this is just the mind creating a story about like what this will look like when it's done, or like whatever, you know what I mean? And what it would say was like, well, I'll be perfect. You know what I mean? Like, and yeah, that's like the stupidest thing in the world. That's like saying that, like, if you wake up, that essentially, like, you'll understand like astrophysics or something like this. You know what I mean? Like, there is an ease with which, like, your demeanor, I think, kind of like shows up, and so I think that in that way, yes, but there's still like some kinks, and I can't imagine having another person to contend with smack dab in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But later on, I can see how essential it was.
Yeah.
To be like, oh, like, what? How is this still showing up? Because the mirror of another person is so perfect.
Yeah.
Because there may be some little subtle sticky points that only a relationship will reflect back to you. Like, where are you still holding on?
Exactly. And I think, so we've had this conversation before, that for me, that having that mirror has been essential for my process, in terms of, like, I, for some reason, needed this mirror directly in front of me in order for those beliefs and that clinging of, like, what love was, in order for those to fully let go.
Unpack that from
and
a
dissolve.
feminine perspective, what love was. Like, because, I mean, I think that's like a very interesting thing that I think is there does seem to be like some clear differences between like a masculine and a feminine thing, just like our traits.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying it's like male and female. I'm talking about, like, there's just some different shit that I think that men kind of like chase versus women.
Yeah, at least the tendency, and this is only like from this experience and this experience, but so there's so much conditioning, like feminine conditioning from like such an early age around like finding Prince Charming, finding the one, finding somebody who's going to rescue you. And whether or not we still ascribe, you know, like to those ideas in like a social setting, like it gets ingrained very deeply. So logically I could say like, oh, I don't need somebody to rescue me. But behind that, there was this story running of just like, I cannot be fulfilled or whole unless I have a counterpart, unless I find the perfect counterpart. And, you know, it's funny too that the way that, you know, it's so common just in relationship in general, but I know I've done this where a relationship will end and I'll say, okay, this is what was, you know, kind of went wrong here. These were the patterns here. I just need to go find somebody different, without realizing that like those patterns need to work themselves out. And like that was part of this process for me. That process of negation is allowing those patterns to show back up.
Yeah.
And
how else could they show up?
Yeah.
I mean, you could run the process through, and you can kill them. I mean, I can speak to this myself. You can upend these things one by one, and you root them out. But there is, for me, the final stage of that process. You can do all the work that you want, but at the end of the day, when the rubber hits the road, if it doesn't count there, it don't count for much.
Exactly.
Because you got to go back and live your fucking life.
Exactly.
And that's like the interesting part about it. And I think that it is like a really interesting thing. But there's that's like what's so interesting is like you can only really go in like your heart of hearts. But I think maybe life does it also. Like life will probably really direct you and be like, okay, like now it's time to let this go. You got this part of the process to do. But I think that's what's so like what traps these different things is fear. Yeah,
it's the fear. So like from when we're talking about like a kind of feminine perspective versus masculine perspective, from the feminine perspective, it's like fear of not being good enough, fear of not being loved, but really underneath that it's a fear of being alone, a fear of being alone forever. And that's why it is essential to actually face off with that aloneness of, can I be okay? And this for me was so essential. Can I be okay with never again living the rest of my life with no intimate relationship.
Yeah.
And like for me, that was a process, like kind of the process when it came to love. And
that's the process.
Yeah, it was the process. And I did have space and time, you know, where we were not together, where I sat in that aloneness, but there was something that was essential for like having a mirror right in front of me that allowed those final little hooks to finally kind of unhinge themselves, unhook themselves. And, you know, I've told you this before that I don't, and, you know, this is just me speaking out of my ass because I don't, you know, this is just the way that it happened. But I don't know that I would have been able to do that if I hadn't had a mirror that allowed that aloneness without creating a story about what that meant. So there was like a full like willingness to allow that process. So there was a full willingness here to allow my process to unfold. And if that hadn't been the case, yeah, like I don't know that it would have worked in any other circumstance. So in that sense, like having the relational, like the mirror held up like in a relationship setting was essential. So going through that process, you know, maybe witnessed by another was essential, but I don't know that I would have been able to do it in a standard, like a dualistic kind of relationship dynamic, or where one counterpart was still in that mindset. I know that I wouldn't.
And then it gets also strange because it's like, and this is on so many different levels. This isn't just like, you know, normal relationship, but there gets to be this point where you realize that somewhere along your process, you dropped your story, and you've been dropping it a bunch, but you can't quite pinpoint when exactly like you let the real sticky stuff go. All that you know is that you can't go back and do it like you did it before. Mm-hmm. And so the notion of it wouldn't even happen. Like at this point, like I would not end up in a relationship with somebody that wasn't operating from at least a pretty similar spot, because it would be over before it even began. Yeah. But it's like it's a very interesting thing when you realize that there's this place where you're like, oh shit, like essentially. But there are like you do realize like there are stark contrasting moments in these processes where you're diving headfirst into full madness, like full insanity, and these different pieces, and you realize you might not know exactly what that's going to look like, but there is an acceptance on a deep fundamental level that you'll never be the same again. And the way that most of the world sees things, you can't. You can kind of remember what that may have looked like, but now it's kind of like it's almost it's like nostalgia. There's like a nostalgia or something about this character that she used to play.
It's very different.
Yeah.
It's very different. And
but it's kind of interesting to think about like that you can't, what we're talking about, like people can give relationship advice, you know, like and essentially what this, like what love actually is anti. It's like the anti-Christ of relationship advice. Like what love, and I was thinking the other day that like these words are very much like interchangeable. Like if you want to talk about, like people would say all there is is love, or all you need is love, and these different things. Love and truth are synonymous.
Love, truth, consciousness.
These are all synonymous words. It just is like where you're sticking, and the funny thing about that is that it's, they are just so different than on every single level. Like when you start to look at just like what you used to call truth or love or all of these different things, I think what you realize is that you're like, I had no idea And you could take any one of these different, like we were talking about the Bible yesterday, and I was like, you know, you could take any aspect of truth. If you were to take it way past your intellectual understanding of it, and you were to let it like live inside of you, you only would need one. Yeah. Like eventually, like that's like truth. What does Jesus say, or Mary? I think it was like, it's like a mustard seed. Yeah. You know what I mean? And
yeah, so mustard, it's the smallest of all seeds, but when it falls on cultivated soil,
yeah,
like then it's able
the process is inevitable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's like a really beautiful thing. But you could interchange the word love with truth. Like these are all like the same exact thing, and they have nothing to do with your story. Yeah. They're highly impersonal and perfectly ordinary. Perfectly ordinary.
And you know the word, so I think we both kind of have a similar...
How crazy is that, though? To be like, love has nothing to do with your story.
No. Has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
That in itself. And it's, you know, it's interesting. I think we both share similar sentiments that I don't really like the word love or like using that word because it's so muddied by all of these different concepts and beliefs and stories. But the word love gets thrown around so frequently in, you know, especially in spiritual circles, you know, and that's not to like put any of that stuff down, but I think that what it's doing, like it's doing a disservice when somebody is speaking from a place of like, oh, everything is love, because there's so many concepts attached to that. But
like what could the mind, what could a dualistic mind create of that?
Yeah.
Just another carrot.
Yeah. Many things.
It's like that's just and what the mind typically, I think, does with a statement like that is that it's dead convinced that if it can basically chase like a peak state, that essentially like there's some grand notion of a love bliss feeling that they're going to attain, like rapture, like they're just going to be in infinite bliss forever. Nonsense. Fucking nonsense.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's what I mean, talking about that word love or truth or anything, like love has nothing to do with concepts. It is beyond duality. It has nothing to do with, you know, desire, passion, all of those things, because those are just stories that the mind has created. It's an idea that the mind has created that it attaches to that word. But like what it actually is prior to all of that. And it's like what we were talking about in the previous episode. Truth is prior to all concepts. Love is prior to all concepts. Yeah. And those words are interchangeable. And from this like lived perspective here of having, you know, a relationship with that understanding, it's like that really what this is human relating that has truth at its very foundation. Yeah. At its very foundation, and it lives there and it lives here, and then those being able to come together. Yeah. And it, you know, living alone, right, but being together in that lived experience of aloneness with that truth or with that love or whatever you
the wild thing is that like that's what's going on all the time anyway. It's just that until you really grapple with that you are alone. Yeah. Like until you really sit with it, and this again is the worst news possible for an identity. Yeah. Because an identity, the fact that it's gonna die, it doesn't exist in the first place. But all of these different things, this is the worst news. This is the worst news possible. But the funny thing about it is that it ends up being what Jesus called the good news. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
But it is a relinquishing of
All of it.
everything. You
All
know,
of it.
Jesus talks
It's
about...
it's a full frontal assault
Yeah.
with what's already going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and Jesus talks about, like, leaving your father and your husband and your daughter and
Yeah.
leaving everything. And that's really, really what that is. Yeah, standing in that aloneness and confronting, I am alone.
All the way alone.
All the way alone.
Yep.
Forever. And, like, sitting with that until it, like, gets to a point where it lives.
Yeah.
And breathes in your gut.
And typically there's a lot of fucking byproduct that goes out the window on your way down to...
It's very painful.
To that thing.
Very fucking
There's a lot of discarding.
Yeah. A lot of discarding. Yeah, it's like, you know, this... You know, I'm just, like, envisioning somebody, like, just, you know, throwing junk out a window or, you know, whatever. But, something else that I did want to touch on that I think we had on our list is kind of getting into... We touched on this a little bit from, like, a feminine perspective, but, you know, a very common dynamic in relationship, which is, like, the chasing and seeking. So, like, maybe... Or chasing on one side and, like, a clinging on another side. And those, you can call that attachment style, whatever it is. But, like, all attachment styles are... You know, just a belief system is still living in that dual perspective, but because that showed up very differently in each of us, and so just like speaking to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, just from a masculine perspective, I mean, I touched a little bit on in the like last episode that, well, you know, the irony of the truth ended up being the thing because I was the worst liar that you can imagine. You know what I mean? And having like a full frontal assault with just the depth of that character disorder, you know what I mean? And really looking at that, and all of my lying was directly linked more often than not with like sexual misconduct, you know what I mean? Like chasing something to validate my story, like my character as, I don't know, like a man or something like this. And there was just like this very much like a primal desire, hunger to chase and chase and chase and chase. And the funny thing about that is like you chase it and then you catch it and you're like, oh, that was completely unfulfilling. But the mind doesn't...
Let me go do it again.
Let me go do it again. And
maybe next time.
It's just like this self-fulfilling prophecy over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And then you look up one day, and what started as maybe something that was kind of like small and juvenile, you can track this kind of behavior back very early. Like before even sex was a thing, I started hiding things. You know what I mean? And there's like a hiding, there's an energy that where these little ghosts live, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they start small, and then they basically accumulate mass, just like everything else. You know, your physical body or whatever, it's just energy, and it accumulates and accumulates. And then before you know it, it's got like its own, it's like a living, breathing identity, and it's this monster essentially that lives inside of you. And I don't have any, I couldn't even fathom giving somebody some sort of like advice on like what to do with that thing, because literally the only thing that did it for me was being forced. Like life put me in a place of checkmate, and my monster was enough that like it needed to be total. Like a small slap on the wrist wasn't going to be enough for this one. This one is hard-headed as fuck. And so life put me in a place of total failure. And I think that if you're paying attention, there's plenty of checkpoints on the way to total failure, where life's basically giving you like, being like, hey, you can jump out now if you want.
Yeah.
But I think typically the way humans are set up, our failures, for what I'm talking about, like for the whole kit and caboodle, they need to be rock bottom, like full devastation, And that for me ended up just like looking like there was no way out. Like there was no outlets for like, let me go over here to some friends, let me go like chase pussy again. Like there was no like career shit at that moment. Like it was just full defeat, you know? But that's like the interesting thing. How do you give somebody advice on like, hey, go get full defeat? The only thing that I can really speak to is if you find yourself in full defeat, don't squirrel. Like don't try and fucking don't try and get out of it. Don't like let yourself let it own you. Let it own you fully. Let it burn the fucking thing down.
Sit with it, feel it, live in it, breathe it.
Yeah.
Rub your face in it.
Yeah. And let it do what it needs to do.
Yeah.
Because if you don't, it's inevitable that it's going to come eventually. Like essentially all that you're doing is like delaying a process.
Yeah, it's these things that happen in these like cycles, and if you like allow yourself to get like spun out of it, but you don't sit with that defeat, it's just gonna come back up in the next relationship or the next whatever, you know.
The weird question I do have to ask myself though is like at this point, when I'm thinking about just how different life is here, and how it's like if the point of dreaming is to dream, like would I actually like advise anybody to wake up? And it's like probably not, but then it's also the potential of like just how simple life can really be. Like, I mean, this thing can be something where the miracles that we create, like from different characters, like these gurus and different people that they create, maybe that's really cool, but like when life gets to just the basic fundamental level of what existence actually is, your life is a fucking miracle. Like all the time, everything. Like you're looking at it and you're not looking for something, you're not looking for grand gestures anymore, because you see the fundamental nature is perfection. So would I want to give that to somebody? Yeah. But is this the worst possible news for a character that doesn't exist? Absolutely. Yeah. It's like all of the shit that you think that makes life so special it's child's play, like compared to what is actually going on. Yeah. So it's like a perfect paradox. Dreaming and waking up is literally a perfect paradox.
It really is, and I think I want to speak a little bit more to the feminine perspective, but
sorry, I got like a little long in the tooth there. My bad.
That's all good. But and this kind of speaks also to the paradox that you're talking about. And I can't speak to whether I think maybe this is a human-wide thing, but I know for me and for a lot of women that, there's something in our relationship conditioning where there's always like a seeking or like falling in love with a potentiality in another human being. And I think in me, when I kind of look at that retrospectively, I think a lot of that was being able to see the unconditioned, like the unconditioned way that consciousness is showing up.
So it's like a blessing and a curse.
It really is, because it's that paradox. It's like having moments of like, I can see what's underneath all of the conditioning and the masks and the beliefs here. I'm going to
That's the divine feminine right there.
I'm going to cling to that.
Right.
And if this thing isn't showing up that way, you better fucking watch out.
That's awesome. And that's so true. I think that like, I feel like something that I've experienced a lot is like, I've been like really blessed to have multiple, like I call them, like I have a song called My Fallen Angels, and like I've had angels in feminine counterparts throughout my life, that they had their own stuff that they carried into these different things, but like that saw something that I didn't even know really existed. Like they saw a better, or not a better, but they just saw a deeper. I don't even know if, now that I'm looking at it, I don't even think that they knew what they were looking at or what.
Yeah.
You know,
and I can speak from that. Like I didn't.
Like this thing has become far more alien than probably they ever imagined.
Yeah. But, you know, actually there's something interesting like from that feminine perspective, because even though, you know, like 10 years ago, if I had looked at this dynamic, I would have been like, that's boring as fuck. Like I have no interest in that. Like I wouldn't have even been able to fathom playing or just like having a dynamic like this. But if I really sit with it and ask, like, my heart of hearts, my gut, like that's what I was wanting the whole time, was to be able to be in that aloneness, that solid aloneness together. But there was so much conditioning layered on top of that. So yeah, the feminine intuition or whatever instinct, like seeing, is such a blessing and a curse, because I had my own conditioning and patterns and beliefs and bullshit, but I was able to like see through the, you know, belief structure, like see through that duality, see through that veil through to like the core of a counterpart in a partnership. But in order to, you know, have this type of dynamic, I had to let all of that go. So, and, you know, one thing that's really interesting is that until, or I can say this now, that until all of my beliefs, all of my ideas, all of my stories, all of my expectations, until that duality fell away, until that process of negation, like full negation, occurred, it was impossible for me to truly see another. Like there were always those moments of being able to see through that thing.
Yeah.
But it was so clouded and muddied by my own shit that, you know, it created this chasing mechanism in my mind.
Yeah.
But what was really being called forth and really being asked for was that full negation, which is so interesting. Like that's such an interesting and cool paradox, that like being able to see through that veil, see through the duality, and creating this chasing mechanism without realizing that like the chasing mechanism itself is what needed to be negated through that negation process.
Yeah.
So that was, and it's you know, that's such an interesting thing. But like wanting, from the feminine perspective, wanting to feel needed or loved or seen, really seen, I think is really what a lot, or at least what I was seeking, I think what a lot of women are really seeking, and humans want to be seen. And it's so interesting, that's
an interesting paradox to think about, because it's like now I am able to see people, but I can't participate in that human thing called love anymore in the same way. Just thinking like what an interesting thing that it is, that it's like what a human being typically wants, like at a fundamental level, is to be seen. But it's almost like they want like it's like an oxymoron essentially, because like what they want to be seen underneath their character. Yeah. But they're insistent that their character exists. But they don't want to have to give up their character in order to be seen. It's like, see me through my mask. Instead of saying, here, let me take this off.
Yeah, it's saying, see me behind my mask, but I don't want to take my mask off.
Because it's too scary.
Yeah, it's too scary to take my mask off.
Or I don't even know that I've got a fucking mask on to begin with. I think it's probably like it's somewhere in between those different things, you know? Yeah. And that's like a really special thing that I think, when you really start to look at these things, this love thing too, it's not just like a romantic or like a partnership in this way. Like this thing, when it really takes hold, it's across the board.
Yeah.
And you know, like I've heard people say, like, if you want to know if you're awake, go spend a weekend with your family. And that's like another beautiful mirror. And I can speak to just from my own perspective, like my father was probably my hardest relationship all growing up. And it wasn't until I realized that through like trying to rebel, all that I did was create another identity that was diametrically opposed to this one. And they were the same exact thing. And once I started to take all mine down, but this is the opposite of what people do, I think. People essentially, they want everybody else to basically pull down their bullshit so that way theirs feels good.
Yeah. Or they want their own bullshit to be accepted. And the only way to do that is for other people to pull theirs down.
And like but the interesting thing about it is like when you really actually start to pull, and I don't just mean like pieces, like when you take the thing down brick by brick, you start to see things that were always there. And when you look at anybody, you can see there's a childlike essence, and I don't care how gnarly they are. Like when you really look at some are a little harder, but if you really take time with a human being to see them, you realize it's all small children. Yeah. Like there's a small child basically just waiting to be seen, and they could be yelling about all sorts of different shit, but all that this is just bullshit that people have accumulated. It's just a bunch of shit, and their life experience essentially has dictated them accumulating these stories. Their stories aren't true. Your stories aren't true. Take yours down, and you'll be able to see love is always here.
Yeah. All the stories. I can't like stress this enough. I think like there's so much talk these days about like, oh, I'm creating a story about this. Stories go so deep. It's not just negativity or like, oh, I have a negative story or a story that's negatively affecting me. It's every story. It's like a story, you know, when my process unfolded, when it came to relationship, like I had to uproot my story around like having a hope of ever becoming a wife, ever becoming a mother, ever like having somebody fulfill something in me.
Let's take a second though. Like,
it's the uprooting of everything.
Like when you were saying that, because I think that these are like very core fundamental things. Like when she would say that again.
So it was the uprooting of my hope to ever become a wife, my hope to ever become a mother, to ever have a family, to ever have like a long-term partnership. And that's not to say that, you know, that like a partnership will never last long-term, but I had to be willing for those things, for those dreams to fully die.
Yeah. I mean, just the weight of that, like that's like the interesting thing about like what this thing actually looks like is that you could really take any of these small pieces and wherever, like whichever one's the juiciest for you, like to really just take that thing and let it grind you down.
Yeah.
And this is like what I think this is the difference between what spirituality actually is versus like what we buy in the marketplace. Like it's not sweet, it's not flowery and all this shit. Like this shit is fucking vicious. Like what we're talking about here is like what love and truth actually are, play for keeps. Like all the way.
It's full defeat. Full defeat. Full dying to everything that you ever hoped. Every beautiful dream that you've ever had. And you know, like the funny thing in that paradox is, you know, it's easy to hear something like that and be like, oh, fuck no, like there's no way I'm venturing into that. And like, that's great. You know, if you hear that and you're like, whoop, staying away from wherever the hell they're at, like, that's wonderful, you know, like, yeah, that's totally fine. But the interesting thing in that paradox is until, at least from this feminine perspective, until I uprooted every hope or dream or want, desire to ever have any of those things fulfilled, until those things were uprooted and negated, I could not fully see or love another.
Yeah.
And I can only say that now in retrospect.
Yeah.
So, and
that quote just keeps giving.
Yeah.
Like it's only through seeing that I'm nothing do I realize that I'm everything.
Exactly.
Like that.
Exactly.
It's just part of the way the thing goes.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like it's important. We covered a lot of ground, and I think that there is a thing like about skillful means and not giving people an out. But fuck it. It does include it. This thing has a perfect equilibrium, and it doesn't. Eventually, you can have your life is going to be your life. You know what I mean? But there is a process to where essentially, like, freedom costs you everything.
Yeah.
Like, to actually be free, freedom. It's gonna cost you the whole ball of wax.
Everything.
But then once it's done, it's fucking done, and then you're free, and you can go do whatever the fuck you want.
Yeah,
Go have
and
a million
it's perfect.
babies.
Yeah, and it's it just to kind of speak to something here too. It's like the way that this operates. It's like full freedom. Like, this human being is free to go do whatever to stay or to leave at any time.
Yeah.
Always. That's just that's what, and with no expectation one way or another. Like, that's what love is. Love is unconditional.
Yes.
Totally unconditional. And I want to speak a little bit too to just like the title of the podcast episode is Finding the One. And just talking about how really what that is like standing fully alone in truth here, like finding that one thing that is prior to everything here, living there, finding it here, living there, and then being able
finding the one is finding,
and then finding it in between too.
The shared.
In the space in between.
But finding the one is like what you would think about that is like finding the one that's going to complete you.
Yeah.
Guess what? It's you.
Yeah.
Nobody else is going to complete you.
And that's funny too is that even just that phrase is going to complete me, because in order for me to complete myself, I had to negate myself.
How weird is that?
It's a weird paradox. It's a weird paradox.
Well, I feel like that's probably pretty good.
Yeah. I just want to end with that Osho quote because I love it, that love is the meeting of two alonenesses.
Thanks, y'all.
See ya.